I am going to begin by sharing an idea and also sharing a new concept. And I just hope that this does not dizzy many of you. The way we record our courses at Harvard is that we keep people present so that we can see who was there and that we can have a better interaction. So I'm going to also ask you to turn on your cameras if at all possible so that we can share. We're a small enough group that we can have a better exchange that way. But I also do this because afterwards our recording will have the people, they will have the presentation, and they'll have the transcript side by side in Zoom, which is actually a wonderful way to document what happened there. So hopefully you'll be able to do that. If you guys are uncomfortable with the way the screen is set up right now, as you all know, in Zoom, you're able to drag your own screen. So you can just pull off one of the sets of people off to the side if you like, so that you don't have to have that kind of double feature here. But I will be filming or we will be recording in this structure so that we can actually see this better afterwards. So I hope that's okay for everybody here. I know that some of you have already done this in your own classrooms, but it actually came to a surprise to the IT people at Harvard that we did it like this, and they were like, oh wait, we've got to teach this to everyone, because it actually does do a better documentation of the experience. So thanks for being here. I am really pleased, and it really is an honor for me. I am sitting here in New York City, so I'll give you a preview. It's an amazing city to come to, so I do hope that you're able to join us here next year as well. So this is kind of the preview with somebody actually in the state right now. It's absolutely gorgeous. I'm going to ask you to be a little bit more interactive than you might be in a normal keynote. And I know many of you already, by your very nature, already take notes. You already write things down. Well, I'm going to ask you to do this for a couple of different reasons. First is to take down the website that Theo mentioned, the learningsciences.com. This is Connections. It's free and open resources, and all of the courses we teach at Harvard are flipped. So all of the videos are up there and available, things about memory, attention systems, cognition, and also the longer version of what I'm going to be sharing with you today is also up there about the 40 different pedagogical interventions that are supported by neuroscience activity. But also I wanted to share my email, because I know that that is often something maybe in 24 hours, you'll think, oh, I wish I'd asked this question or that question. And I would love to support your exploration into this field, this crossover area of neuroscience and technology. The main reason I'm going to ask you now, from a neuroscientific perspective, Evelyn, Carl, any of you have a good idea here why writing is such a good idea? Why do we ask students to write? Why do you ask people to write things down? Evelyn knows. She's like, oh, well, that's obvious. Why do we write things down, Evelyn? I saw a good face there. It was like, go ahead, open your microphone and tell. Why do we insist that people write things down? Evelyn Vishwanan. Are you going to type in the chat? You can't unmute. Oh, I'm sorry, you've been blocked. Sarah has blocked you all. Okay, I'm going to give you a hint, and you can confirm with a happy smile, Evan. Is this the reason? We know that all learning depends heavily on well-functioning memory systems and on well-functioning attention systems. Without memory and without attention, and/or without attention, there is no learning whatsoever. So if I say, why do I ask you to write? The basic reason that writing extends this fragile memory that we have, even if you just write down 1 or 2 words here and there. So Ellen had the right answer, I see, right? So even if you write down 1 or 2 words here and there, it will trigger memories for certain concepts. So I do ask you to please write, because we're going to put this to the test at the end of my talk. In about 30 minutes, I'm going to ask you, are there 3 things that were mentioned this morning that you didn't know before? Or maybe, I knew this, or I studied this once before, but I have totally forgotten about it. It's not in my practice right now. So are there 3 things that were new? Then I'm going to ask you, are there at least 2 things that were just so cool and interesting that you want to continue to research into the future? And that if you are interested, we have what we call bundles. These are mini libraries on every single topic you can imagine. We have 92 bundles on everything from emotions and cognition to universal design for learning to things that have to do with motivation, as well as all levels of conscious and unconscious learning. So sleep, the impact of sleep on learning, for example. We have bundles on everything. So if you're interested, we will send those to you so that you have access. We update them regularly at Harvard, and they're automatically updated. We figure out a cool system in Google Drive so that when we update things, everybody gets an updated list of all of the up-to-date readings in neuroscience that affect learning outcomes. But the most important thing is if you can identify one thing you might change about your personal or professional practice, Laura, that would really impact the way your students are going to gain things. We know that having one-off conferences doesn't do a whole lot to change learning outcomes of students unless you participants, those of you sitting there without your cameras on, if all of you are not actively trying to extend your experience by taking notes, going deeper, and then will be curious enough to research further, this won't make a big difference in your classrooms. But if you do take the time to do this, your extended experience will make a difference in your classroom. So I'm going to encourage you to do that. So what are we going to do today? I want to put us into this context of this COVID or post-COVID era, the catalyst for change that has occurred here, in the context of my book that just came out last month with Columbia University's Teachers College Press called Bringing the Neuroscience of Learning to Online Teaching. And then I want to share with you 40 pedagogical interventions. We're not going to get to all 40 of them, but I am going to introduce the concept and invite you to look at a handout that has all of these things available so that you can have an idea, and we can talk about that further when we have the question and answer session. And Sarah will share that in the chat with you right now. Where does all of this come from? Back before COVID in 2017, the OECD convened an expert panel to try to figure out what should be teachers' new knowledge. How should new teachers be trained? What is the recommendation that we can give to teacher colleges around the world based on the new information that's out there? Since 1989, this had not been updated. And so they were trying to figure out what should we update. And what came out of this is going to be no surprise to you guys, but they thought that we really needed to have much more neuroscience and much more technology integrated into teachers' formation. Teachers were not getting in their general initial formation information about this. And so that was already being called upon in 2017. And this brought upon this new model, right? Before, it used to be enough to know stuff, right? You guys, maybe I'm much older than some of you guys, but when I was in school, you know, you would have college professors who just knew a lot of stuff, and that was just amazing. And just knowing things was enough. Well, knowing things is not enough anymore. We know that if you don't know how to teach that information, and specifically if you don't have pedagogical content knowledge, if you don't know how to teach your specific content area, you're not going to be that great teacher. So you have to have both content knowledge, pedagogical knowledge. And as of 2004, those of you in this group are probably very familiar with the TPAC model that came into being, where we said you have to also understand the tools you now have available through technology that will help you save time, that will allow you to be more personalized with your students, because you can offload some of that grunt work to technology. How can we do that? But then starting around 1991 with the founding of the learning sciences, and then 2007 with the formalization of the International Mind-Brain Education Society, and last year's Global Learning Science Network structure, this idea has now been pushed in many universities, and within the United States, this is under the Deans for Impact initiative, that all teachers should really know more about the brain. How does the brain really learn? It's not enough to have all these cool gadgets, and it's not enough, you know, okay, I know how to teach face-to-face. You need to know why something is going to work for Francesca and not work for Gail. There's this huge individual differences in where kids are coming in based on what they have as prior knowledge. And so how does the brain really learn? So this is something that we're saying new teachers really have to have a grip on. This means letting the machines do what they do best so that teachers can do what teachers do best, and that humane aspect of learning, which is really part of the focus of my book. We then have to consider all of this within the context of your own schools and cultural influences. There's some really fascinating work in an area called cultural neuroscience, which is showing that there are some things about the cultural artifacts in our own environment that do change the way information is stored in your brain. For example, the biggest cultural artifact we have is writing. So writing systems, the way you write numbers, also has an impact on certain neural networks in the brain. So understanding context and culture, but also the culture of your own school. how does that shift now our vision of teachers as being more like learning scientists, not just people who deliver information or content, but who actually understand the pedagogy as well as the technology, as well as how the brain learns. That is the main goal here. We also now, thanks to great research, finally have longitudinal studies about education. So formal education is only about 170 years old, where we require everybody to go to school. And it wasn't only until about 100 years ago that we decided we should really do some longitudinal studies, what really has an impact. And finally, we now have studies that look at people in different parts of the world with different types of teaching interventions and saying, what actually impacted them over the course of their life. For example, the first studies on Head Start in the United States, early childhood programs, finally comes out. So we finally get to see when you have a type of intervention, what it can make, how it can make a difference. So that's added to our knowledge base. But we also have internationally comparative studies now. Before, everybody was limited to the language that they knew, and that was it. The lingua franca currently is English, and so most publications are in English, and now Chinese has taken over as the lingua franca. But being able to share findings in these different cultural contexts was difficult until, thanks to technology, we now have things that have become better and better. Google Translate used to be awful. Now it's actually pretty good. And so having translational skills has allowed us to have insight into what's going on in other cultures, which has leapfrogged research in many places. People were waiting for somebody to discover something. Well, they don't have to now. Now they can actually have that sharing much quicker. We also have a change in methodologically comparative scales. So if you guys know educational research, there's a lot of stuff that goes on quantitatively, where we count test scores, right? Or qualitatively, where we talk about, quality of mental health care or things like that, self-reported studies. Quantitative and qualitative used to be, you couldn't do it. Well, now we can, thanks to John Hattie's work in New Zealand, who's found a way to show effect sizes. What has a bigger impact on student learning outcomes? So now we're able to gather all of this information internationally as well as methodologically, and combine that with information about the brain to now have a new vision on what it is that we really need to be doing in teacher education, and helping teachers leverage some of this information to teach better and have better learning outcomes. So with that in mind, this is my model of the learning sciences. I really believe that we have taken recently, especially recently, information that was input from technology and instructional design, as well as from neuroscience, and understood ideas from cognitive science and psychology, and especially from mind-brain education at that intersection, taken into consideration cultural input, and now have this new vision of what comes out of education. So we know that the learning sciences are complex, but basically you can no longer live in your single silo. Those of you who are used to being educators or technology experts, we now realize this transdisciplinary vision is yielding far better information for teaching and learning outcomes. And so what was the main goal of this particular book? It was to talk about, but believe it or not, I was writing the book before COVID hit. And then when COVID hit, the editors went crazy and said, well, we got to get this done and get this out as fast as possible. Well, the idea was, what can we do that's beyond emergency remote online teaching that would be reflective of these long-lasting changes, the new normal in education? What will remain after the pandemic is done just because it's better? It's better, a better way to teach and learn. So that was the goal of this particular book. And so the way that we did this was actually, you guys, all of you who have been in classrooms this past year and a half, realized that many of you went from face-to-face, then to online, then you went back to a hybrid model, and some of you had to go back online and then back to hybrid before you could finally go back to face-to-face. Well, this is amazing. So congratulations for having survived that, and for being so resilient. This amounts to pretty much 16 months of professional development. And you would think that a lot of you guys would be burnt out by now, but you're actually here in the middle of July actually doing more of this, which means that something unexpected happened, which was really pretty interesting. And that was that the pandemic did not affect us the way we thought it did. In fact, a study that came out 2 days ago that summarized 1,000 studies on mental health during COVID showed basically that people were pretty bad for the first 3 months. Getting into the summer of 2020, we started to get out of it, believe it or not. And more studies are actually showing that it didn't actually have a hit on education as gravely as we thought it would. Again, this is all relative. School systems that were doing well stayed doing well. Those who were behind got further behind, obviously. But the learning losses, we were estimating years of learning loss, they actually weren't as horrible. They were horrible, but they weren't as bad as we thought. We also saw that generally resilience, the ability to adapt and pivot so quickly, was actually something that humans, we were all able to do much better than we had thought we were able to do. So some surprises have come out of early research that's going on right now. So I just like to ask what you guys think. We know that we've gone from these extremes of face-to-face to going 100% online, and there's this middle space. But if you could just put in the chat, I'm curious to hear, just to take a quick poll here. Do you think the future, the new normal of education, will be going back 100% face-to-face? Everybody's so joyous to be able to have these face-to-face encounters. Or do you guys think that there's going to be some kind of a move towards the middle? If you could just put something in there in the chat. I'd like to just take a quick poll to see where you guys think things are going. What modality do you think is going to dominate in education in the future? I think that's something that I'd like to gather and talk to you more about in the future. So is it going to be more blended model, more towards hybrid, or are we going to go back 100% face-to-face would be the question. Okay. So given that in mind, I just want to share a quick synopsis. My book has 6 chapters. The first one uses a moving metaphor. And this is really kind of fun, Katie, because it says, Katie, have you ever moved house? Katie Olson, have you ever moved? Or have you just been in that beautiful home forever?
Oh, no, yes. I've moved from Florida to Alaska.
There you go. Well, that's like kind of the other extremes there. So here, let me guess and tell me if you asked anything else. When you were moving, Katie probably thought to herself, okay, so what do I keep? What am I going to toss? What do I need to just give away? What are some things I might as well just put in storage because maybe I'll need them later? What is something I can replace? And what are things I actually need to get that are brand new? I'd like to use this as a metaphor for what happens when people start to think about moving online or moving back or moving to hybrid. One of the biggest questions we have right now is, what do we keep from all that we experienced? What are the things that are worth hanging on to? And that's what the book begins with as an introduction. Chapter 1 has to do with how we find this information from neuroscience and how this explains the teaching learning dynamic. Chapter 2 has to do with the pedagogies that we're going to be talking about in just a minute. Chapter 3 has to do with tools, the different tools that we have going on. And I saw some great presentations that are going to happen at your conference about this. Basically, what we found is that there are things such as multi-course platforms, which were available to teachers. There's also software that saved them time checking for plagiarism or doing surveys, things like that. Podcasts that were out there. There are also websites that were pre-structured lessons for teachers, for example, or repositories, and many, many apps for all different school subjects, as well as this grand new world of gamification, which is going to be the dominant factor as far as trends are concerned in education coming up soon. So this is one of the chapters in the book. And then we go to one of my favorite chapters, which is about time and space. I'm going to challenge you with an idea of Angel. The idea of school used to be space bound. We have school and we have homework. We talked about spaces. And now we actually talk about asynchronous versus synchronous learning. How does it happen in time, which is a very different way to think about things. This has changed our school calendar. It's changed the way we thought about the balance of activities in our class. It's also changed how we think we can save time by leveraging technology. So those things are quite different as well. So in a typical course, you might have asynchronously that kids are doing quizzes and watching pre-class videos and answering discussion board prompts and then exploring your resources in your mini libraries or bundles. Then you meet up synchronously and you have a live class that would actually have a reflection that takes place right afterwards. And then after that, you would have other asynchronous activities that would have to do with redoing things. In our course at Harvard, anything that is graded, students are allowed to rewrite. So for example, if they take a quiz or if they write to a discussion board and get a grade, or if they do their reflections and they're not happy with their grade, they are allowed to do it over. They lose 10 points for timing, but they're allowed to do it over. Why? because anybody who can learn from their mistakes should be given the opportunity to do so. And this is one of those things that we have not ever thought about in school and education before, but it's now something that's coming with this new idea of rethinking time in education. So I hope you guys will take that into consideration. If you have questions, we can explore that further. The fifth chapter has to do with instructional design, which most of you who are designers do this already, but a basic way to structure courses based on clear objectives. And if any of you are not designers and are interested, we know that one of the best ways to learn anything new is through a worked model. So if you're interested, our course is in Canvas and we use Zoom. If you'd like, there's hyperlinks to a tour that one of my teaching fellows gave to the students, so you can walk through the class and see how we actually have our instructional design created within the Harvard class. And the sixth chapter is just to celebrate. There has really never been a better time to be a teacher. We are now, as educators now, in a whole new era. There will be pre and post COVID understanding of education. And we are at a very special moment where we get to watch all this happen. So the three big messages of that book are to let machines do what they do best, to let humans do what they do best. And then we need to leverage some of these older tools. We use discussion boards to create community. We use quizzes to check for knowledge, but not as a graded thing. Our students can take the quizzes 1,000 times. I don't care. I just want them to have the vocabulary and the concepts before they come to the live class. So we use old tools for new purposes. And then we also have to understand that teaching will never be the same again. It is different now, and it will be. For all great teachers, teaching is different. And so I hope that you embrace that as not something scary, but something real. So let's get to these evidence-based pedagogies. I'd like to take the time to do a 1-minute paper. This is going to give you 60 seconds to only do something on your own paper. And that is basically on any piece of paper, draw a line down the middle, just right down the middle, and draw a happy face on one side and a question mark on the other side. And basically, the only thing you're going to do in 60 seconds is put at least one sentence on each side. What do you know already about the difference between teaching online and good teaching face-to-face? What are the differences? Okay. And secondly, what is something you want to know? What is something you want to know more about related to this difference between face-to-face and online teaching? So on the left side, something that you know, and on the right side, something you want to know about that. And if you could just take the time to put in the chat the thing that you want to know. You want to know. Well, you say that time has changed a lot, but teachers' timetables haven't changed. How do you expect teachers to do more synchronous as well as asynchronous work if there's no pay for that? Or if you have a question like that, go ahead and put it into the chat. This will be what we're going to be using as jumping off points for our further discussion at the end of the talk. So I'm going to be quiet and give you 1 minute just to think. I've just thrown a lot at you. Just take a little time to let the dust settle and think about this question for a second and put your answer in the chat, please. So my personal heroes here today, Ellen, Bacalo, Francesca, Fernando, Vangel, Shirley, you win prizes here. I'd like to invite you to write to me. I'm going to be sending you a free book. You guys are the brave souls who know how to participate and make the most of your experience. So thank you for adding those ideas here. We are going to pick up on those later. Thank you. So if these are these ideas, I want you to start with the first concept of planning. And basically it's to know what your goal is. We know that in understanding by design, basically you have to figure out what your objective is first, then how you're going to evaluate it, and then decide what do you do. Okay, so if that is the way that we should be doing all educational planning from the micro level to the macro, the first thing I want to throw at you is that planning for an emergency remote class or a MOOC or a webinar is nothing like planning for a high quality online course. And if you're interested, Appendix B shows, in my book, shows the 40 differences between those kinds of planning that have to do with design as well as evaluation options that you have. So please remember, I'm going to be only talking about quality online courses. I'm not talking about setting up a MOOC. MOOCs are going to be very different animals, and they have very different purposes from what the goal is here. Okay, so these pedagogical interventions have evidence behind them, and as Teo mentioned, that is really one of the most important things for us, is to be able to say that there is evidence behind this. And I wanted to give you about 4 minutes of where the background is, and then jump into examples of some of those pedagogies. Over the past 11 years, actually now 13 years, We've done studies which involved educational experts from neuroscience, education, educational psychologists, people who call themselves mind-brain education scientists. And the most recent study we completed in 2020 had 112 people from many different countries around the world. And the last one, we had people that were from 29 different countries. So this was not a America-centric concept or Ecuador. My husband's from Ecuador and I was in Ecuador up until 6 months ago. So it's not from Latin America, it's not from the Americas. This is something that people from all different countries agreed upon, which was kind of interesting because we didn't do a regular survey. We actually asked people to support their opinions with evidence. So if they said, oh, I think that teachers, this was the question, what should teachers learn about the brain? And if Bekalu, if they said, well, I think teachers really need to learn more about neuroplasticity because here is my evidence. Here are a dozen articles that show neuroplastic changes in children in schools. This is real, this is true, this is something all teachers should know. So we had them provide evidence. And so in doing so, we were able to create and begin to create all these bundles that shows the evidence for all of the ideas that they basically ended up confirming. So what did they confirm? Out of the OECD's division, they said in all the literature that teachers read, let's have 4 categories. There's stuff that's well established. There's just no doubt. There's a lot of great evidence out there. It's overwhelming and it's longitudinal. We can see information over time. There's other things that are probably so, but there's a lot of human variance there. So can't really say. We know that motivation is important for learning, but what motivates a person is very relative to the individual. So that's probably so. It's not the same for everybody, as well established. Then there's other stuff that's intelligent speculation. Okay, men and women look different on the outside, therefore their brains must be different on the inside. That's, you know, sort of intelligent speculation, but there's just no evidence for that. So that's kind of intelligent speculation. And then there's neuromyths. And what this group actually found is that there was tons of neuromyths still floating around in educators' textbooks and in conferences like this. People share a lot of information without evidence, but there's only a handful of things, 6 principles, and only 21 things that we call tenets. And those are the things that I'm going to share with you right now. These are the only things that they could actually find evidence for and agree upon internationally. And learning styles, exactly, is a myth, a huge myth, which I hope that we can get rid of, okay? So in international agreement, there were these 70 neuromyths. There were only these 6 principles that were true for all brains, independent of age and culture. And by the way, there's no such thing as a truth in science. It's just evidence or no evidence or lack of evidence. So there was a lot of evidence for some things and 0 evidence or evidence against the neuromyths, okay? So we're just going to look at these principles and tenets so that you understand where it is or why the new recommendation of teacher training should look this way. We should first get rid of the junk. There's just so much bad information out there that puts a roadblock to good learning. If you think your kids have learning styles, obviously you're treating them differently and they will learn differently. If you think girls and boys have different aptitudes for science or poetry, you're going to treat them differently and they are going to learn differently. So your misinformation will cause problems. So the first thing is to get rid of the myths. The second thing is to teach the good information. And then the third step would be to put all of this in the context of your classrooms, of your personal school environment, of your country, and then decide which of these instructional guidelines make sense to you, okay? So this would be the order of events that we would like to recommend at this stage. And so the challenges, though, is there's a lot of things. We think that we can multitask. You cannot multitask, okay? Your brain can only handle one heavy cognitive load task at a time, which means if you think that you're listening to me talk and you're preparing breakfast for your little kid and helping them with their homework right now and getting ready to take the dog out, you're not paying attention to this, okay? So you cannot be in 2 places at once, literally. You actually have a divided attention. Learning styles, left and right brain, men and women, the 10% use of the brain, classical music, all of that is junk. And we have to get rid of that in basic teacher education because there's an awful lot of universities in the United States that still use learning styles surveys for their new freshmen. That's appalling. So we have to get rid of that. These are things in the popular press and even some universities are promoting that. So what are these principles? And these things, I'm going to go over them more quickly than I'd like. We teach a whole semester on this at Harvard. You're welcome to join the class because we accept undergraduate, graduate, and non-credit students in the class. I'm going to share these with you briefly. And if you are interested in a longer, more detailed explanation, you can go to thelearningsciences.com and watch a whole video on the principles if you want. One of the first principles is the uniqueness of the human brain. We can track common neural networks for how a child might learn to read, Junko. Okay, so we can see that both in Japanese reading and also in English reading, we can see typical neural pathways, but none of them are identical. No two people have identical pathways. Do you know why, Leslie? What keeps people from having identical brains? Their brains are unique because of what?
Experiences?
Perfect, perfect. No two people live the same experience. Therefore, they do not have identical neural pathways. This should have an impact on your teaching, if you know this, okay? The second idea is that there are different potentials. Genes do matter. We are all born with genetic potentials for certain aptitudes. However, other research now shows that your ability to self-control and self-regulate accounts for almost double innate intelligence. So you know that we're born with different potentials, but that's not everything. It's not just all nature, all what you're able to do, but nurture accounts for a lot. If not, we wouldn't have schools. The nurturing you get in schools potentiates those genes. Only a fraction of the genes you're born with, Dennis, are actually potentiated by the environment you're in. So school makes a big difference. Your environment makes a difference. Only a fraction of what you're born with is actually potentiated by where you grow up and what schools you go to. So that's a huge important idea as well. The third is that all new learning passes through the filter of prior experience. What you already know, Camille, influences what you can know. Your prior experience creates this filter and also influences the way you take in that new information. Prior experience is vital to understanding new knowledge. We also know that there's constant changes in the brain, which is really big for teachers, Claudia, because we can become impatient sometimes, right? We can try to teach in one way, do one thing, repeat things over and over. If any of you have ever taught a kid how to read, you know this frustration of spending days and months trying to get that kid to read. And in one day, he reads. But he didn't learn to read in that second. He actually had to have the priming of multiple neural networks already at the same time before he can show you the behavior of reading, okay? So there's multiple changes that happen at a molecular level that you do not see in behavior for some time. So that's another thing about patience for us. The fifth point has to do with neuroplasticity, which is something that most teachers are very familiar with these days. We all know that your brain is neuroplastic and does change throughout the lifespan. And finally, these pillars of memory and attention. These are vital for all teachers to understand. If you know these 6 basic principles, this can guide you in a lot of choices of activities, things that help address and honor the uniqueness of individual brains or of prior experience. All of those things are important to take into consideration as we plan new activities. These are true for all individuals. Then the tenets, which are even more microscopic, but I hope most of you have downloaded with Sarah, the link to the full presentation so you can see the slide better. We know, Ellen, that motivation influences learning, but what motivates Ellen does not motivate Gail, okay? So we know that these are important and vital for learning, but you have to know the students or you can't use this. We know that there is no cognition without emotion. So you have to first take care of fragile mental health states before you can talk about higher order math, okay? Stress, anxiety, and depression all influence learning outcomes, and there are different combinations of neurotransmitters in the brain. We also know that people love to be challenged and they hate to feel threatened. So how do you find this perfect balance, this Goldilocks spot where it's just right for those learners? And not only one person, but the whole class. How do you manage that? How do we teach teachers to read facial expressions? I see Laura is so intensely into this and she's looking at the slide. She goes, oh my God, this is microscopic. I need to find this in a bigger format because I can't really get it. But at least she's engaged. I can tell she's there, right? So reading facial expressions, hearing tones of voice. There's a difference in telling a kid you're doing just fine and you're doing fine. So learning to manage our voices, right? The understanding and appreciation that learning is social. This is what came out a lot in COVID, is that people just wanted to be together. They didn't care what they were doing. They just wanted to be together. The role of attention and giving attention to the student-centered activities. The idea that learning is not linear. All these silly teaching for dummies books that say do A and B will happen, it's just not true. Learning is a much more complex process in which there's 2 steps forward and 1 step back, and you're kind of going up this spiral staircase. It is not a linear process, especially where the brain is concerned. We know that there are conscious and unconscious processes. Patricia, you cannot learn something new in your sleep. Like you can't put like the Arabic textbook under your, or play the video and learn that in your sleep. But you actually can rehearse something that was explicitly learned in real life. If I teach you die, das, der and all the German conjugations and in real life and explicitly, in your sleep, you can actually rehearse that. So there are conscious and unconscious processes to learning, which is pretty fascinating. We know that learning is developmental as well as experiential. And I'd like to ask, Peter, here's a big question. I'm going to ask you all this, and I'd like to see how many of you get this one right. Which of these 3 things is most important in determining if a person can learn or not? Their chronological age, their cognitive stage, their prior experience. What has more influence on their ability to learn something new? What do you want? Take a stab at this, Peter. Bingo, Richard. Yes, Leslie. Yes, Sarima, Evelyn, you guys are right. Peter, was that what you're going to say? You're holding out there. Definitely prior experience. So we know that there are developmental processes that more than a kid's age, which is crazy. Why do we divide kids by age? Nobody can answer that question, right? Rather than by their prior experiences. That would be the way to go, really. We also know that sleep and dreaming, as I mentioned before, are important for learning, but sleep helps you pay attention and dreaming helps consolidate memory. But how much sleep and dreaming Carl needs is different from how much Cohen needs. So we know that between 4.5 and 12 hours is normal. 8 can be the average, but we cannot dictate that all 9-year-olds need 10 hours of sleep. That's crazy. That's just not true. We know the influence of nutrition as well as physical activity on learning. We also know that if you learn something, but then you don't ever employ it, those neural connections weaken. And we also know that the role of feedback is vital for learning, but different people like different kinds of feedbacks at different levels and different formats in order to achieve their best. We also know that learning within relevant and meaningful context is vital. And then finally, novelty and patterns. Your brain is always looking for what do I already know and what is different about this. It's always comparing and contrasting in order to learn best, okay? So given all of those things, we came up with these pedagogies, and the pedagogies were based on your different goals that you might have in school or your classes, what principles and tenets supported it, how we say this in educational speak, and what are the pedagogies. And they were in 12 areas of mastery learning, deeper learning, metacognitive abilities, growth mindsets, daring to err, making mistakes as a part of learning, optimal performance, relevant curriculum, differentiation and autonomy, social contagion, building strong learning communities, personalization and communication. And because we have so little time, I'm just going to give you a taste of 1 or 2 of these. Goal, and if your goal is mastery learning, you should use universal design for learning. It's fantastic. We know that some people can do steps and everybody can do ramps. So why aren't our class designs around this lower common denominator to have multiple entry points to the material? So this would be one way to help facilitate mastery learning. Another way to facilitate mastery learning is understanding that different people need different things at different stages to reach the same objective. We never have a homogeneous group of students in our classrooms, really. Not everybody is starting at the same point. And what we know from good old Benjamin Bloom back in 1984, just pointing this out, at least 90% of the kids in your class can actually meet all of your learning goals if they just had enough time, because some of them need to fill in prerequisite knowledge. So being able to give what everybody needs so that they have the right starting point so that they can all end the same is a key to instructional design and also to mastery learning. If your goal was to go deeper with learning, flip your classroom. This keynote should have been flipped. If I'd flipped it, you could have listened before, and then we could spend the whole time just talking, which would be really much deeper and more meaningful experience to each of you, right? So flipping is a key idea, not just for classes, but for conferences. Another idea for deeper learning is to understand the brain adapts to what it does most. So concept of interleaving, which means that you teach something, then you leave it alone for a couple of days, and then you come back and you re-emphasize it, and then you leave it alone for a week, and then you come back and you reintegrate it. Those kinds of systems are brilliant. In the German school system, my kids, I can tell you, they know every bit of math that they ever learned through the entire school system, mainly because they had interleaving throughout. They always continually reinforced throughout K-12. It was not like you taught the chapter on algebra and left it alone. It's that you're continually returning to that and reinforcing those concepts. That enhances memory systems, therefore learning, right? If your goal is metacognitive awareness, you need to train executive functions. We know from Moffat's study in 2011 that self-regulation accounts for almost double innate intelligence when it comes to learning outcomes. So kids need to have better executive functions, and those can be trained. So we need to be working on those as well. If your goal is to have better mindsets, then you have to accept, kids have to understand, you are not just your zip code or the genes your parents gave you. You are much more than that. So we need to be teaching a better understanding of the brain to kids themselves. They need to understand brain health as well. We also need to help them see more globally, holistically. The sum is greater than, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So just, okay, I'm lousy at math, I'm a bad human being. No, you're not. It's a piece of you, but it doesn't define you. So how do you get all of these pieces together? How do you see that person more holistically within schools? Getting kids to dare to err is creating that time in your classroom for do-overs, and that does create more time. If I'm going to allow students to resubmit assignments, I need to bake that into my planning. So have I done that already? So that's hugely important. And appreciating that mistakes are a natural part of learning. So using something like frequent low stakes testing allows people to make mistakes at a low cost to them, but the learning can be huge because they can reinforce the areas that they've missed before, okay? So there's multiple ones here. There's a long list that you've been given in the chat. There's 40 of them there that I look forward to talking to you, with you about, but we don't have time to go through all of them in detail. And as I mentioned, there is a longer video that it would explain each of these and the evidence behind each of these elements here. But I would jump just to the end to summarize that our last point here is to get in sync. I have been talking at you for 30 minutes, and that is not a great way to learn, Alan. It's totally not. It's totally not. You need to be a bit more engaged in order for you to actually have some of this sink in, which means getting in sync, which means hopefully leveraging your chats. In our classroom, we have somebody manning the chats all the time and responding immediately to the questions. Wait, did she say Benjamin Wet? Who was that and what year? And they type it in for you. So immediately your brain is not distracted. Have you ever been told in a conference, Sebastian, keep your questions to the end? That is the dumbest idea ever. Your brain can't do that. Your brain is wanting to get an immediate answer. So teachers have to get in sync, which is why we're going to turn now to the questions. So I hope you can download that list of pedagogies. And I hope you appreciate from these ideas that the new normal here is going to save us time. It's going to reach more students. It's going to allow us to differentiate. We can become more personalized with our learning, and we can enhance these learning goals that we have of deeper learning, growth mindsets, and even mastery. So I tried to put this in the framework of where we are now, using a little bit of the background of where the book is coming from, some of those pedagogies. And I would like to beg you, if you have the time, and not just for this presentation, but for everything that you go into today and for the next couple of days, think about, did you learn anything? Is there anything that's interesting? And might you even change something? And if you say no to that, then this conference was a bust. And if you can say yes to that, you can actually say this was actually well worth coming to. So please take the time to reflect. That's one of the things that we also shortchange in education, is giving people downtime to mentally digest the information, which is why we're going to give you a little bit of a break now and to come back full force with a lot of great questions, which I hope you're going to share with us. I'll put up one more time my contact information, and I thank you very much for your attention this morning, and look forward to hearing a lot of juicy questions from you. Thank you.